Mary Magdalene had been dead more than 500 years when a sick man in Rome stood up and changed who she was. September, the year 591. The man was Pope Gregory. The sermon was routine, and the sentence that did it took 8 seconds. Everything you picture when you hear her name, the loose hair, the jar, the tears, starts in that room. By the end of this, you will know exactly what that sermon took from her, and it was not her virtue. Gregory had been pope for a year and had not wanted the job. The sermon survives, numbered 33 in his collection of homilies on the Gospels, preached at the basilica of San Clemente on the Ember Friday of September. The appointed reading that day was the story in Luke 7 verse 36-50 of a weeping woman with a jar of perfume. Somewhere near the start, Gregory paused over the identity of the woman in the reading and made a decision. The woman Luke calls a sinner, he said, and the woman John calls Mary, and the Mary out of whom Mark says 7 demons were driven. We believe these to be one person. Then he asked what the 7 demons stood for and answered his own question, all the vices, the whole of them. 3 women in the Gospels became one woman. And because that one woman was called a sinner, and because Gregory then explained that the perfume in her jar had previously been used to make her body pleasing for forbidden acts, the composite figure acquired a specific past that none of the 3 had ever been given by any writer of Scripture. You have probably heard some version of that. A pope invented a prostitute. It is mostly accurate and almost entirely beside the point. Here is what I want to argue instead. Gregory did not take away her virtue, he took away her job. Hold that. We will come back to it, and when we do, the reason it matters should be obvious in a way it cannot be yet. Start with the sermon itself, because almost nobody has read past the famous sentence, and the rest of it is not what you would expect. Homily 33 is not an attack on Mary Magdalene. The target is the man sitting across the table from her. The reading Gregory had been given is the scene in the house of Simon the Pharisee. A woman comes in uninvited, weeps on Jesus' feet, dries them with her hair, breaks open her jar. Simon says nothing out loud. He thinks something instead. If this man were a prophet, he would know what kind of woman is touching him. Gregory spends the bulk of the sermon on Simon. He calls him a man sick with a disease he does not know he has, sitting beside a sick woman who does know. He says the doctor was in the room between 2 patients and only one of them had noticed. And then he turns without warning on his own clergy. There are bishops, he says, who have performed one externally decent action in the exercise of their office and now look down on their congregations. Who hold sinners in contempt? Who refuse to feel anything for the people confessing faults to them? If that woman had come to the Pharisees' feet, Gregory says, he would have kicked her away with his shoe. Sit with the shape of that. A sermon whose entire argumentative weight is aimed at religious men who despise women with a past. And inside it, almost in passing, the sentence that would give the West 1400 years of religious men despising a woman with a past she never had. I do not think that is ironic, I think it is diagnostic, and I will say why later. For now, the second thing worth noticing, Gregory was not slandering her. In the logic of his own sermon, he was promoting her. She is the hero, Simon is the villain. The whole rhetorical machine of the homily depends on the woman being as low as possible, so that the mercy shown to her can be as high as possible. The lower she starts, the further grace has to reach, and the more devastating the rebuke to the sneering clergy in the pews. Gregory needed a great sinner. He built one out of the parts available, and that, more than any malice, is why the thing lasted. Nobody wanted to argue with it. A slander invites correction, a gift does not. Now let us look at what was actually there before the merge, because the woman in the text is stranger, and considerably more interesting than the woman in the paintings. Her name appears 12 times in the 4 Gospels, more often than most of the men in the inner circle. Among women, only Jesus' own mother appears more. In every list of women where she is mentioned, she is placed first. The one exception is the group standing at the cross in John 19 verse 25, where the mother of Jesus is named ahead of her, which is not much of an exception. Ancient writers ordered names by prominence. Whoever assembled these lists thought she came first. Look at how the other women are identified. In Luke 8 verse 1-3 we meet a group traveling with Jesus and the 12. Joanna is introduced as the wife of Chusa, who managed Herod's household. She is located by her husband, and her husband is located by his employer. Susanna gets nothing at all, and Mary gets an epithet of her own, not daughter of, not wife of, not mother of, the Magdalene. For a woman in the 1st century Eastern Mediterranean, that is unusual to the point of being conspicuous. Women were normally fixed in place by the men they belonged to. This one is fixed by something else, and the something else has been argued about for a very long time. The standard answer is geography. Magdala, a town on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, known to Greek writers as Taricheia, a place that processed and salted fish. The name comes from the Aramaic and Hebrew word Migdal. It means tower. Most study Bibles take that reading, and it may well be correct. There is a problem with it, though, and the problem has been getting louder in scholarship over the last few years. Joan Taylor, in a study published in the Journal of Biblical Literature in 2021, worked through the earliest Christian writers who discussed the epithet and found that none of them identifies a Galilean city called Magdala by the Sea of Galilee. Not even the ones who knew the region intimately and wrote guidebooks to it. The pilgrimage site later shown to travelers as Magdala is attested from around the middle of the 6th century, which is late. Jerome went further. In a letter written in 412, eulogizing a Roman woman named Marcella, Jerome mentions Mary of Magdala and says she was called of the Tower because of the earnestness and the ardor of her faith. He is not describing a postcode. He is describing a character reference. Jerome, who lived from roughly 347 to 420, and who spent decades in Bethlehem translating the Bible into Latin, knew the geography of Palestine better than almost any Christian writer of his era. He had every opportunity to say she came from a town. He said she was a tower, which puts her in a specific and rather remarkable category. Simon becomes Peter, the rock. James and John become the sons of thunder, and Mary becomes the tower. Caution is needed here, because this is contested, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. Plenty of good scholars still read the epithet simply as a place name, and the town of Migdal exists. An excavation there has turned up a 1st century synagogue. That case is not dead, but the alternative reading is now serious enough that presenting the toponym as settled fact would be dishonest. And here is my own view, offered as a view. Even if the geographical reading wins, the point survives intact. Every other woman in that list is anchored to a man. Mary is anchored to something else, a place or a nickname, it does not matter which. In a document written in a world that did not do that for women, somebody made an exception for her, and the exception is preserved in 4 separate accounts. Now the 7 demons, because that phrase is doing an enormous amount of work it was never asked to do. Luke 8 verse 2 says, 7 demons had gone out of her. The longer ending of Mark repeats it at Mark 16 verse 9. Nothing else on the subject survives. 2 mentions, no explanation, no backstory. 7, in the numerical vocabulary of these texts, signals completeness. 7 days is the whole of time. 7 demons is not a tally. Rather, a way of saying totality, total affliction, and then total release. What it is not, anywhere in the Gospels, is a sexual accusation. Go through every case of possession in those 4 books. Convulsions, muteness, deafness, blindness, a boy thrown into fire, a man living among tombs who cuts himself with stones and cannot be restrained, isolation, violence, physical torment, social death. Not one of them involves sexual sin. Not one. So if you want to extract a prostitute from the phrase 7 demons, you must arrive already carrying her. The text will not supply her. Gregory read the 7 allegorically as the 7 vices, and it is worth saying clearly that this was not a scandal in the 6th century. Allegorical reading was the standard method. He was doing what everyone did. The problem is not the method, the problem is what the method needed. An allegory of total sin requires a sinner, and a sinner requires a sin. And when a 6th century Roman preacher reached for a woman's characteristic sin, he reached for her body. Then he attached that to the perfume, and explained what the perfume had been used for before. There, precisely, is the invention. Not the merging of the 3 women which had been in the air for centuries. The supplying of the sin. Let me pull the 3 of them apart, because once you lay them side by side, the seams are hard to unsee. The first is the woman in Luke 7. The woman has no name. Luke names people constantly. He names Chusa, he names Joanna, he names a centurion's household, and he does not name her. Luke calls her a sinner in the city, and her sin is never once specified. The scene is in Galilee, early in the ministry, in the house of a Pharisee called Simon. Then Luke turns the page, and in the very next verses introduces a new set of characters, including Mary called Magdalene. If Luke had just told a story about her, that is an extraordinarily strange way to write. The second is Mary of Bethany. Different region entirely, Judea, not Galilee, sister of Martha and Lazarus. She appears sitting at Jesus' feet in Luke 10 verse 38 to 42, and at her brother's tomb in John's 11th chapter, and then in John 12 verse 1 to 8, 6 days before the Passover, pouring a pound of expensive nard on Jesus' feet while Judas complains about the cost. John tells us her name. John tells us her village, her brother, her sister. John, who is the only evangelist to describe her anointing at all, never once calls her the Magdalene. He simply calls her Mary, and he calls the other woman Mary Magdalene, and he does this in the same book, 8 chapters apart. The third is Mary Magdalene herself. Galilee, Luke 8 verse 2. Then she disappears from the narrative entirely until the crucifixion, at which point she is suddenly everywhere, at the cross, at the burial, at the tomb. And there is a detail in that sequence which I think should have stopped the merge cold. On the Sunday morning, she comes to the tomb carrying burial spices. She has bought them. She intends to anoint a corpse. But if she is the woman with the alabaster jar, then the anointing at Bethany was hers. And Jesus had already told the room that it was done for his burial. She would know. You do not go out and buy grave spices for a body you have already anointed for the grave. I offer that as a reading, not a proof. Harmonizers have answers, and the answers are not absurd. Grief does not always behave logically, and burial customs involved more than one stage. But the tension is real, and it sits there in the text, and the composite has to work around it. The shape of what happened is easier to see as an image. Imagine 3 witnesses to 3 different incidents in 3 different towns. Each describes a woman. A sketch artist listens to all 3, takes a feature from each, and draws one face. The face is vivid, far more memorable than any of the 3 separate descriptions, because unlike them it has a story. A fall, a collapse into tears, a forgiveness, a life afterwards. The 3 real accounts had no story. They had fragments. The sketch goes up in every town square in Europe. It goes into stained glass and altarpieces and cheap prints, and eventually into films. Now suppose that 400 years later, somebody proves the 3 witnesses saw 3 different people. The poster does not go blank. It stays exactly where it is, on 10,000 walls, and it is now a face without a person behind it. And it is more familiar than any of the 3 real faces ever were. Since 1969, the Western Church has been standing in front of exactly that poster, and we will get to why in a moment. But first, the thing that was actually lost, which brings us back to the claim I made at the start. Turn to the 20th chapter of John. Mary stands outside the tomb in the dark, crying. She mistakes the risen Jesus for the gardener and asks him where the body has been taken. He says her name. She turns. Then in verse 17 he gives her an instruction. The Greek imperative is poruo, go, and in verse 18 she does. The text says she comes to the disciples angelosa, announcing, bringing word. Some manuscripts have the compound form apangelosa. The root is identical either way. That root is angel. It gives us angelos, messenger, and with the prefix eu in front of it, meaning good, it gives us euangelion, the good news, the gospel, the word the entire literature is named after. So the first person in the Christian story to perform the verb that the noun gospel is built from is a woman standing in a garden at dawn holding spices she no longer needs. There is a second word worth having. Apostolos, apostle, is built from apo, meaning from, and stello, meaning I send. An apostle is not a rank. It is a description of a movement, one who has been sent. She is sent, explicitly by name in the text, with an imperative verb and a message and a destination. That was the job. Not victim, not cautionary tale, not the model penitent. First witness and first sent. What Gregory took was not her virtue, it was her job. Because a composite figure does not have a commission. She has a past. Everything the Western imagination did with her afterwards, the cave, the skull, the hair, the tears, the bare shoulder in 100 oil paintings, is the working out of a past. None of it is the working out of an assignment. She stopped being the woman who told the apostles and became the woman who needed telling. Now, a correction to the popular story, because this channel does not get to deploy convenient history just because it is convenient. The merge was not Gregory's invention, he ratified it. Tertullian, writing in Carthage somewhere between 155 and 220, was already blending Mary of Bethany into the picture. Ambrose of Milan, who died in 397, could not make up his mind. Augustine, who lived from 354 to 430 and thought about almost everything, called the identification an open question, and allowed that there might have been 2 separate anointings. Jerome thought the merge was mistaken. Further east, Origen in the 3rd century and John Chrysostom around the turn of the 5th kept the three women firmly apart, and the East never changed its mind. The confusion had therefore been circulating for 3 centuries and more before Gregory opened his mouth. What he supplied was not the idea, it was authority, and the missionaries, and the manuscript tradition, and the fact that his homilies became one of the most copied preaching resources in medieval Europe. Carolingian scribes bound them together in the 9th century, and they were still being read from pulpits, 800 years later. I want to say plainly that the tidy version of this story, one pope, one sermon, one act of misogyny, is too tidy, and we should stop telling it that way. It flatters us. It lets us believe a single villain is responsible for something an entire culture found useful, repeated, painted, funded, and enjoyed for 1400 years. This was never one man's doing. He said out loud, with the weight of the Roman See behind him, a thing many people already half believed and rather liked. Which brings us to the denominational question, and it is not the one most people expect. The Eastern churches never made the merge. Mary Magdalene there is a myrrh-bearer, one of the women who came to the tomb with spices, and she carries the title Isapostolos, equal to the apostles. Separate commemorations were kept for Mary of Bethany and for Luke's unnamed sinner. The iconography never made penitence her defining feature. I should be honest that Eastern tradition is not spotless on this. Some Orthodox devotional material does describe her as having led a sinful life before her healing, but it never fused her with the woman in Luke's 7th chapter, and it never built an entire visual and institutional culture out of her supposed fall. The famous story of her presenting a red egg to the Emperor Tiberius is charming and almost certainly legendary, and late. Here is the part that should give Protestant viewers pause. The Reformers inherited the composite whole and did not touch it. Luther kept the traditional reading. The Book of Common Prayer of 1549 kept the feast on the 22nd of July with the same readings the Latin Church had used, and added a new prayer asking God for grace to repent after her example. This is not a Catholic error that Protestantism escaped. Everybody in the West bought the sketch. Anyone reaching for this story as a stick to beat Rome is holding the stick by the wrong end. What happened next was expansion, and it happened fast once relics entered the picture. By the 9th century, the Abbey of Vézelay in Burgundy was claiming to hold her body. In the 11th century, a life was composed to explain how a Galilean woman ended up buried in France. The story ran that after the resurrection she was put out to sea in a boat with no rudder, along with Martha, Lazarus, and others, drifted to Marseille, preached to the pagans of Provence, and then withdrew to a cave in the Saint-Baume for 30 years, clothed in nothing but her own hair, eating nothing, lifted into the air by angels at each hour of prayer. Jacobus de Voragine, a Dominican who was born around 1230 and became Archbishop of Genoa, collected that account into the Golden Legend around 1260. It became one of the most widely copied books of the later Middle Ages. In 1279, Charles of Anjou ordered a dig at the church of St. Maximin in Provence, and relics were duly found and the pilgrim traffic redirected south. Then came the painters, who were handed a subject that was devotional and sensual at the same time, and could be painted as both without anyone objecting. Loose hair, the jar, a skull for mortality, the wilderness, the bare shoulder. One more opinion, and it is an uncomfortable one. The eroticized Magdalene of European art is not a secular corruption of a pious tradition. The penitent Magdalene is the direct product of a pious tradition. The piety supplied the sexual past. The artists simply painted what the preachers had given them for 600 years and then got blamed for it. Now the cost, and I want to be exact about this rather than dramatic, because exactness is worse. In 1758, a London merchant named Robert Dingley opened an institution in Whitechapel. The place was called the Magdalene Hospital for the reception of penitent prostitutes. Its first intake was a group of girls aged between 9 and 14. In 1765, Lady Arabella Denny opened a similar house in Dublin, a model spread across England, Scotland, Ireland, North America, and Australia. Hundreds of them were operating by the end of the 19th century. In Ireland they lasted longest and went furthest. Between the founding of the state in 1922 and 1996, at least 10,000 women and girls were admitted to Irish institutions of this kind, for pregnancy outside marriage, for being the daughter of a woman, who had been pregnant outside marriage, for being considered too attractive, for being an inconvenience. They worked unpaid in commercial laundries. Many never came out. The last one, on Sean McDermott Street in Dublin, closed in October of 1996. The Irish state issued a formal apology in 2013. Precision matters here because overstating the causal claim would be a cheap win. Those institutions were built by many forces at once: poverty, class, the economics of free labor, the politics of a young state, and the ordinary human appetite for putting shameful things behind a wall. A sermon preached in Rome in 591 did not put 10,000 Irish women into laundries, but it did supply the name. And the name supplied the theology, that a woman with a sexual past is defined by that past, and that the correct shape of the rest of her life is penance. You cannot imprison 10,000 women on the strength of a sermon. You can, however, name the building after a woman who was never in one. The corrections when they came were remarkably quiet. In 1969, under Paul VI, the Roman calendar was revised. A note published with the reform stated that the July celebration concerned only Mary Magdalene, to whom Christ appeared after the resurrection, not the sister of Martha, and not the sinful woman whose sins the Lord forgave. The Gospel reading for the day was changed from Luke's 7th chapter to John's 20th, nothing more than that. No encyclical, no campaign, no new art, a footnote in a liturgical book set against 1400 years of altarpieces. The following year, 1970, Jesus Christ Superstar was released, and the Mary Magdalene on that record is the composite, because in 1970 she was the only one available to anybody who was not reading Vatican liturgical footnotes. Then, in 2016, something louder. A decree dated the 3rd of June and published on the 10th raised her July celebration from a memorial to a feast, the same liturgical rank given to the apostles. The decree and the accompanying commentary by Archbishop Arthur Roche were both titled Apostolorum Apostola, Apostle of the Apostles. Roche's argument was simple. She was an eyewitness to the risen Christ, and she was sent to bear witness to the apostles themselves, which is precisely what an apostle does. If that is what she did, the calendar should say so. One caution, because the neat version of this is circulating too, and it is not quite right. You will often hear that Apostle to the Apostles is an ancient title that was suppressed and then restored. The evidence is messier. Thomas Aquinas, who lived from 1225 to 1274, used it in his commentary on John, and that use is solid. A 9th century life attributed to Rabanus Maurus uses it, though the attribution is disputed. Hippolytus, writing around 235, used something very close to it in a commentary on the Song of Songs, but that text survives only in Georgian manuscripts. He applied the phrase to the myrrh-bearing women as a group rather than to her alone, and he himself blurred Mary of Bethany into the picture. The historian Catherine Ludwig Janssen has noted that the exact Latin phrase is close to impossible to trace before the 12th century. So the title is old, and the idea behind it is older still, and the clean narrative of an ancient honor deliberately buried is tidier than the sources will bear. If we are going to correct one story by insisting on the evidence, we do not get to build a replacement story that ignores it. And now the part I find hardest. The composite Magdalene was loved. Sit with the discomfort in that. For 1400 years she was the patron saint of everybody who had done something they could not undo. A person who could not see themselves in a virgin mother or a fisherman apostle could see themselves in her. Her story was standing proof that the door does not lock behind you. Whole devotional traditions, hospitals, orders and confraternities grew up around that idea, and for a great many people it was the only version of Christianity that felt survivable. None of which is nothing. It may be the most pastorally useful figure the Western Church ever constructed, and she was constructed out of a woman who did not need constructing. So here is where I land, and you are free to disagree. I think Gregory got something profoundly right and something badly wrong, and the two cannot be separated, because they were the same act. His instinct that no past disqualifies you, that the contempt of religious men is the sickness and not the cure, is correct, close to the center of the whole thing, in fact. He simply attached it to the wrong woman, and the attachment cost the real one her office. Which is why I said earlier that the irony in that sermon is diagnostic, rather than amusing. A man preaching against religious contempt handed religious contempt its most durable target, and did it inside the same 20 minutes, and never noticed. That is not a story about one bad pope. That is a story about how the thing works. Step back as far as it will go. Christianity does not rest on an argument. It never did. It rests on testimony, the claim that certain people saw something and said so, and would not stop saying so. Every creed that follows, every council, every schism, every cathedral, every argument in every comment section underneath every video on this channel, is downstream of somebody having seen something and told somebody else. The first person to do that was not Peter, nor was it John. A woman stood in a garden before sunrise, holding burial spices for a body that was not there. She was told to go, and she went. Gregory did not take away her virtue. He took away her job. It took 1400 years to hand it back. A quiet footnote in 1969, a decree in 2016 putting her feast at the same rank as the men she was sent to find. Whether that lands is not really up to Rome. What decides it is the picture that arrives in your head when you hear her name. If what arrives is the loose hair, the jar, and the tears, notice where that picture came from. It came from a sermon, not from a gospel. So read the 20th chapter of John slowly this week, and count how many times she is the one doing something, going, looking, asking, turning, speaking. It will not take you 10 minutes, and it may permanently change the picture. And then tell me in the comments what you were taught she was, and who taught you it. A film, a Sunday school teacher, a painting, a song. I want to know how far that sermon traveled and whether it is still moving.